Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. I think it was two dogmen hiding in the woods that night. Tonight I'll be sharing the second half of my conversation with Phil, a gentleman who lives in a small village in the Biddulph area of Stoke On Trent. When Phil was younger, he had some encounters with some unexplained creatures where he was shadowed in a woodland close to the Serpentine and Knypersley reservoir. One of the creatures he saw moved across the land in a bear-like manner. It was heavily built, but moved fluently as it made its way out in front of Phil, as its companion jumped down from a tree behind him. Phil felt he would be forced to confront whatever was stalking him in the darkness that night. This happened in an area he knows well, where his family members have also experienced weird happenings on the land down there. While we chatted, Phil shared another experience with me that happened when he was out with two friends and they saw a tall, hugely built, hairy bloke who was standing in the trees behind them as they sheltered from a rainstorm. All three of the friends didn't hear him arrive or leave, yet when they searched for him with torches, he completely disappeared. In fact, if he hadn't been caught out in the matchlight, they would not have known he was back there. And why was he in those bushes that night? What was he doing? Was he there solely for his own purposes, and the boys stumbled into him? Or did he intend to be seen by them? No doubt these are all questions Phil has asked himself over the years many times. Phil did some research into the area online, and he kindly shared the information he uncovered on the Biddulph family who owned the land and built the property in the area. The Biddulph family crest shows a vulned wolf, or a rampant beast with an arrow in its flank. The name Biddulph means to live besides the wolf. Their family motto is seek the higher things. The local public house is named the Bleeding Wolf, and there are stories in the area about shucks, large cats, missing sheep, cattle bitten or taken in strange circumstances over the years. In fact, the whole of Staffordshire has the same problem, with many kills being blamed on domestic dog attacks. Yet farmers will tell you they know what the attack of a dog looks like, and what they are finding is something far worse. When I first chatted with Phil, he explained that he never shared his experience with his family members. He didn't feel that he could. And it was only decades later at a family party when his father asked if he ever felt scared down there, meaning down near the pools and the Serp. Like most witnesses, he spent the intervening decades convincing himself that it didn't happen, but failing. You know it happened, and nothing can explain it away. Now, as he's older and he has more hindsight, that comes into play. And you begin to remember other experiences you had then that been filed away successfully, that suddenly tie into the event that tipped the scales enough to start you seeking answers. Because sometimes answers outweighs the fear. You don't fear being ridiculed when you're in search of answers. A lot of people who reach out to me do so in order to discuss one or two experiences that have been their worst. The event that tips the scales, the one that breaks the camel's back. But invariably, there will have been other events, strange and unusual, that they hadn't put together before. Even if it's been there all these years, right in front of them, it still takes something spoken, experienced or heard to suddenly tie these events together. This can happen as I chat with people, and I ask them to jot down any memories that come back to them before we sit down for our next chat, or any questions that they have. And I think it helps to see all of your unexplained events in a list, as it makes it easy to see just how many there have been. And it has been the same for Phil. As we chatted over the last few weeks, he's looked at other experiences in new light. If you look up Biddulph on the Google Maps, you'll see the Serpentine and Knypersley pool. Now, there was an old manor house there, long gone now, but parts of the walled gardens are still there, and it's a place many people visit for all kinds of leisure activities. Like most of Staffordshire, it has natural cave systems along with old pit mining shafts, and they stretch for miles underground. Phil knows the area like the back of his hand, and his unusual experiences all happened in the woods and the fields around him there. Many years later, he realised it was the same for some of his family members too. And like most of us, we hear things as children, as adults explain things, and we don't really pay attention. But those events suddenly take on new meaning now, and we wish that we'd listened harder at the time. I want to pick up where we left off last week, as Phil went on to explain other strange happenings down on the land there. And then let's look back in time to earlier events that I feel are strongly connected. For all the years prior to the invention of the internet, Phil could not name the creature he saw running like a bear. It was after this he heard about Dogmen and how the witnesses to them described their behaviour, their description, and their habits out there on the land, that he realised that Dogmen may have been the creatures he was dealing with that night. At the time, Phil was out checking traps he'd set for a local farmer. He was walking there with his dog. When he reached a certain point of the track, he was hit with a brick that was thrown from the rhododendron bushes on the right-hand side of the path. Within seconds of that brick being thrown at him, something heavy dropped down from a tree and made off across the field. Phil knew that the creature was heading him off, and as he planned his way of escape, he heard a heavy thud in the unnatural darkness behind him as a second creature dropped from the tree. It was so heavy, Phil felt the ground shake as it hit the floor. He tried to convince himself it was just two local yobs out to mug him or any unfortunate person who was walking that way that night. But the thing he saw across the field in the dark ran down on all fours, not upright like a human. Now here's a transcription of my conversation with Phil. I never knew what those things were that scared me that night, and it wasn't until I came across a report in an American blog from a man living in the nearby village of Mocop that I realised I was not the only person here who'd seen a large canine creature of some kind when they were out setting traps for rabbits. That man's daughter said he was out of the house for 10 minutes and was as white as a sheet when he came in, and he'd never set foot that way since. He described what he saw as a werewolf. I think I saw the same thing, or the same kind of thing as him. I was out doing the same thing at the time. He said what he saw was a dogman. Trying to find answers online to this, Deb, is impossible. I was scared that night, and I don't mind admitting that. I've never been that scared before or after. So I started checking out what dogmen were, and it led me eventually here to you. When I made it into that big circle of light on the path that night, I thought I was dealing with a person. So when I was in the light, I thought I'd at least be able to see what I was up against. The circle of light was a good 2 feet or so, So I knew he had to pass through it to come in my direction, and when he did, I'd be able to weigh him up. Even just a silhouette would help me size him up. At that stage, I thought I was up against 2 heavy-set men, one out in front of me and one ahead of me in the direction I was going. I was also really worried about my dog, as he'd taken off without me, and I was worried for anyone who came across the dog, as he was in a right state when he left me. Even when I caught up to him, he wouldn't come back in that direction, no matter what I tried. They didn't have to show themselves to me. I couldn't see them. So why did they initiate this encounter? If they had not thrown that brick at my leg, none of this would have happened. And why they did is one of the answers I'm searching for. All these years later, I think these things live in our fear. I was so scared it took me about 5 years to go back that way. And even then, I had 2 friends with me. So I didn't expect anything to happen. So to return there and see something just as scary was a lot to carry on my own all those years. And just like the huge hairy bloke in the leaves we saw behind us that night, I have no explanation as to why we saw him or what he was doing there. Other people have reported large hairy men who are thickly muzzled and live wild there, in our woodlands and fields. I've lived here for almost 70 years, and I know the land like I know myself. It's changed over the years, but you can still see the area's age when you're there. The Biddulph family connection is interesting, as it showed a wolf with an arrow in its flank on their family crest. I asked Phil if he had any experiences outside at night when he was in the woodland, or an area thick with bushes and shrubs. And he shared an experience from just last year in the winter of 2023. And Phil said, "Last year in November, I was walking along the old Biddulph alleyway that takes you north to Congleton. I walk there regular at night. It's a cinder path, so it's really easy to walk on, even in bad weather. Gives you a good footing. I take the dog with me. My night vision is still really good. I don't need a torch, but I do carry one with me, tucked in my pocket just in case. It was about 7 p.m. and dark, and it was just me out there and the dog. When I heard a really loud scream. Following the screaming was the sound of soft running feet padding down the cinder path coming towards me, and they were breathing heavy. I put my torch on, and it was a young girl in her 20s running down the path on her own in the pitch black. That worries me, as there could be anyone out there hiding, just waiting for a young lass to come along. She shouted, "Help me!" as soon as she saw me, and looked back over her shoulder and said, "Someone's following me." I shone the torch in the direction she looked, and in the light I caught a yellow eye, and it disappeared behind a tree. I asked her to phone someone and get them to come for her, but she didn't want to walk out to the car, which was parked quite a walk away alone. But she was also nervous, as I'm a stranger to her. I don't think she knew what to do, so I suggested I'd walk her back to the car and she should take a photo of my face, send the photo to a family member or friend, and keep them on the phone until we got to her car. That reassured her, so that's what we did. And she was clearly really shook up. I gave her my name while she was on the phone, and we got back to the car and she left. I never saw her again after that. As soon as she left, I headed back up the track in the direction she'd come from, where I saw the yellow eye disappear behind the tree. For it to give off yellow eye shine, I know it's not a bloke or a fella waiting in the bushes. Humans don't give off a yellow glow. I know if I have my picture taken, I have red sheen on my eyes, but this was different to that. Not the same at all. Even now, my night vision is perfect due to how I was raised. I had lots of uncles, and they all knew the land there. They were raised on it. They hunted these woods and streams back then, and they passed their knowledge on to me and my siblings. I know what I was seeing was unusual. There have been incidents going back now where I've been with them that made me realise my uncles and family members may have had their own thoughts on this weird stuff that happened there. Even their own experiences, perhaps. I told you about the time my dad was a young lad and he was waiting on some roosting birds with his brother, and they had the fright of their lives. My uncle had his granddad's greatcoat over his shoulders like a cape and was using it to keep warm, and it was yanked from his shoulders by something unseen. They both fired in panic on a holly bush that suddenly started shaking violently. They were that frightened. That happened to me on more than one occasion, and I've heard growls coming from the holly they fired at, and it terrified me. So much so I went back and I cut it down. Then I didn't know my dad had had that experience at the same bush many years earlier. I've had earlier events that sat on a shelf in the back of my mind until I spoke to you. I had a few experiences other family members shared, they've made me think long and hard. The head of our family was not a drinking man, but he would have more than a glass or two of rum every year just on Boxing Day. He'd tell us his stories, as we were growing up, but he would never speak about the war. But one Boxing Day, he said out of the blue, "I always felt sorry for that Prussian fella." And I asked him what he meant, and he explained that he and some of the members of his regiment, who were all local lads, had to run a bayonet charge on a huge Prussian guy who was over 7 feet tall. And as the story goes, my relative, who was at least 2 feet shorter than him, realised a bayonet would not do anything. So he dropped to one knee and fired at him. And as he did, his comrade standing behind him also fired, and they saw his helmet blow off. He thought his shot had done that until his comrade explained my family member hit him in the chest as the guy was so tall. His companion fired from standing up, and that was a shot that hit him on his head and made his helmet come off. They both said it was the biggest man they'd ever seen in their lives. And that's what that hairy man thing I saw was built like. It was a huge mountain of a thing, thickly muscled and really tall, far taller than any man I've ever seen. He moved silently and was suddenly behind us. There was no noise to him. We didn't hear him moving off when we caught him in the matchlight. We should have heard the trees and bushes moving as he went through them. We looked everywhere with the torch, and he was nowhere. There was no sign of him anywhere. When my family members came back from war, one of the lads was injured, and they had all had their own tales to tell, no doubt. But people never shared those things in those days. I would imagine they spoke in private when they were together, as they were all really close and were until they passed on. Being from the countryside, they always had something for the pot, and people would swap backwards and forwards, food items between families. So they would often be down there at the brooks, in the woods, the fields, hunting and fishing, etc. in the dark. I remember one day being at the brook down there tickling trout, and I had the dog with me, and he barked and looked in the opposite direction of where I was looking. But the brook was pretty loud and I couldn't hear anything. So I stood up, and this was the first time I saw a holly bush shaking violently. It was not bad weather, it was a lovely day, sunny. The sun was really shining and nothing was blowing, but this bush was moving like it was in a hurricane. And being curious, I went to go towards it to see what was happening, and I heard a mechanical snap, clunk, behind me. I turned, and it was one of my uncles who told me to go home as Gran was looking for me. She had your tea on. He had his shotgun over his arm and told me I'd better get back there quick. He lit his pipe as he watched me go, and then he started to walk towards the holly. Now, at that time, it wasn't long after the Moors murderers were happening, and we were often told not to talk to strangers or go to certain places that weren't deemed safe. But no one ever warned me about the brook until the day after I saw that bush shake. When I got in from school, I was told not to go down that way. I don't know what was in that bush, but it concerned the adults enough so much I wasn't allowed to play down there for a long time. But as a kid, I thought it was to do with a stranger being down there. I never went anywhere without the dog, and he was vicious if he was protecting me, and he'd picked up on something. So the adults must have felt I wasn't safe there, even with the dog alongside me. I felt transfixed by that bush shaking, and it was only on hearing the mechanical snap of my uncle's gun that brought me back to my senses. You said it yourself, Deb. That's kind of worrying, because we don't know what would have happened if I'd walked towards it and touched it that day. I was only young when that happened, and it was a long time before I saw the creatures down at the Serp. But there was an event after that I think is worth mentioning. I was up at Gillow Heath while training a hunting dog for a friend. I had his pup with me, and we were hunting, trying to show him the ropes really. And it was summertime, and I was training them on the lamp when my old dog stopped suddenly and looked off into the distance. I could see something out there on the edge of my vision, so I lit it up with a lamp. It had a long face, so I presumed it was a horse in the fields way off. It was big enough to see, and I could see the shape of its head. I was convinced it was a horse, but it had to be big, like not a pony, something tall like a shire. The next day I went back during the day in good light, had a walk around down there. As the farmer was a mate of mine, he didn't mind us hunting on his land. I didn't see anything up there, and there was no horse in the paddock. So I walked up to the farm for a chat, and I asked him what horse had been in the field, and he explained he didn't have any large horses on the property, just a Shetland that his granddaughter rode. Well, that really puzzled me, as the creature I saw was really big. I wouldn't have been able to see it in the dim light from that distance unless it was of substantial size. It was like a big dray horse or something, 17, 18 hands high. I told him I'd definitely seen a horse in the field that night before, and he confirmed it wasn't an animal from his farm. I remember the length of its face clearly, so I don't know what that was. The night after this, just a couple of fields further north near Whiteley, I saw a bloke, and I say a bloke because he was running on two legs really fast across the field. He was a dark grey colour, moved quicker than Usain Bolt, the athlete, for about 40 yards. I thought to myself, cook me, he can move, but I can't explain it any more than that. If it was a bloke, he would have been faster than Usain Bolt. I could see his legs and arms pumping, but I was so far away I couldn't make out any detail. He ran all the way across and into the tree line. I don't think it was a farmer or a normal bloke, but it sticks in my memory. It was definitely not a person. I asked Phil if he could remember anything happening in his room at home, or if he could share one of his earlier memories that stood out to him. He explained that he saw a dark shadow on a number of occasions as a small child in his room, and when a very close family member passed away, he was thinking about them exactly at the 24-hour mark, and the family heard a huge bang on the window of the home. It sounded as though someone had thrown a brick at the window. And that time, all the family dogs started to howl like wolves with their heads up in the air. We both agreed that that was probably the spirit of his loved one, passing on and letting him know that they were okay and he would be too. And there was another occasion when a relative passed on and a loud bang was heard at the family home. Phil said, "You asked me, Deb, if I'd seen anything in my room at night, and I told you about the dark figures, the shadow men I saw as a kid. But I also had a weird dream once that I've never forgotten. Well, one night, before any of this had happened, and before I saw that thing up near the pools, I had a really lucid dream. In a dream, I was with one of my brothers down at the brook, and I was showing him how to tickle trout. Out of all my brothers, he was the worst fisherman, the worst hunter, and the worst shot. But he always enjoyed himself regardless. In the dream, I'm in the water with my hands under the bank, and he sat on top of the bank watching me. And as I felt the fish settle in my hand, he shouted my name really loudly and said there was a dog coming our way. The dream was so lucid, it felt real. I looked over the bank, and he was right, as a huge black dog was coming our way on the opposite bank of the brook. The bank on that side was about 10 feet tall at that point, and the dog just jumped it. It leapt to the other side over our heads in one fluid movement as we watched it. Then it kept going, and I said, "That's a fucking wolf, not a dog." And I don't remember anything else. Well, this was long before I knew about the wolf connection to the Biddulph family that the area is named for. I wonder now if it's all tied in somehow. I asked Phil if he knew of any other weird activity in the area, and he explained to me about a time when his traps and snares would be empty, and it puzzled him how the animals had been removed from them. And he said, "I went through a stage there when my snares were set and triggered and something was empty in them. I thought it was a fox at first, taking advantage of an easy meal. But the snares were closed up, so I can't think how they got the animal out through that tiny hole without removing the animal's head. But on occasion, I'd smell an awful smell, 10 times more pungent than a fox, and the dogs were never bothered by it though. It wasn't a smell that lingered or stayed in one spot. You'd smell it every now and again as you walked the traps. I went back and forth that day, and I smelt that smell about 4 times. After that, things started to happen, and I began having trouble at home. Back then, there was no remote control for the telly, and the UK only had 4 channels to choose from. And for no reason, the telly would start to randomly switch channels on us, and it'd flick quickly between them and end up back on the channel we were watching. I've had TVs in my house our entire lives, and this was the only time one had done this. And then my wife said that the old twin tub washer was giving her a shock when she used it. It was mine before she moved in, so I went to have a look at it for her. I couldn't see any problems. She told me to touch it, and I did, and nothing happened. But when she touched it, she got a massive shock of it and shot back her hand. So I touched it again, and this time I felt it. It went bang as it shocked me. I checked, and something had unscrewed the earth connection inside the plug, and it worked fine after I fixed it, but we couldn't be sure. So I told her to pick out an automatic washer, and we'd have that fitted. So that's what we did. This was brand new from the showroom, but the same thing started to happen again. Then the positive connection on the kettle was unscrewed, and then it was the iron that had its positive connection unscrewed. This went on for about 6 weeks. One day my cousin came over with his girlfriend for a visit. We all sat chatting happily, and his girlfriend asked if she could use our bathroom. She went off happy enough, but when she came back, she looked really scared. She came bouncing down the stairs, and I asked if she was all right. And she quickly said, yeah. And then she said to my cousin, come on, I want to go home. And she insisted, so that's what they did. I worked with my cousin, and he said the next day that the lass had seen a ghost in our house, and he asked me if anything weird had happened there. He said she was sitting on the toilet, and a black shadow passed in front of her, and then vanished as it went. I said it might just have been my eldest getting up, but he'd said that to her, and she insisted it wasn't one of the kids, and there was no noise connected to it. It was just a dark shadow that appeared in front of her and then shot off. When I got home from work, I went round the house and said that I didn't want anyone scaring who lives here, anyone scaring who visited here, and that they had to stop messing with the electricity, and everything calmed down. I didn't need to do anything more than that, and that seemed to work, as nothing happened in our home again after that. I don't know what they are, Deb, or why we see them, or why they scare us as they do. I don't know if they're demonic, dimensional, as they must have some form to be able to throw a brick at someone. I think the things I saw were hunting, and they've been doing that down there since the dawn of their time. There are a lot of old ancient sites down there, and some holy wells too. Do they tie into all of this? Is it all part of the same thing? I was always told not to be afraid of the dead, as it's only the living that can hurt you. But I remember one day I was out with my uncle, and he was teaching me to shoot a bow. And he explained that a bow hunt only worked if you hunkered down and stayed completely still so nature didn't worry about you. But if you had to move, look up and check the trees above before you did. I presumed he meant we would scare the birds and give away our position. But what if he meant something else? As a child, you don't know what to ask. I wish they were still here, so I could ask them these questions. If I'd looked up when that brick hit me, I may have seen them up there that night in that holly tree. You mentioned people seeing the shook there, Deb, and it reminded me of a friend that lived up near the moor. One of my good friends lived up there, and he was adamant that he'd seen a large black cat attacking a horse one day. The poor horse had slashes all down its flanks, and about a year ago there was a large cat seen at the same spot on the road. A few people on Facebook mentioned that they'd seen it too, and that's exactly where the holly bush sits, and that started shaking, the one that's down at the brook. Another time when I was down there, a black dog that was big like the breed, like a Newfoundland, came running at me, barking and snarling. So I fired my catapult near it and it backed off, but it came straight back, so I fired a shot and it ran off. I know every dog in that village, but I didn't know this dog. It was a huge, shaggy black dog out there on its own. I asked Phil to take me back to the place he had felt was his most terrifying experience, the one that he had with the two Dogman creatures that night in 1980, and how now, with hindsight, would he act. And he said, if I went there tonight and saw that thing again, I'd do things differently. I'd stand my ground. Not knowing what they were is awful. I've carried that fear with me for over 40 years, and it stopped me going down there alone, which is the opposite of me. I had to stop doing things I love doing and visiting a place I love to be. That is the only thing I could think of that gave me that level of apprehension. And as I say, when I went back with my friends, it happened again. But now I want some answers, or at least to discuss it and see if I can find peace with it all. I'm so glad I finally contacted you about it, Deb. In fact, the first time I contacted you, I vanished. At that time, I wasn't in the right frame of mind to get all this out there. That's really normal, and I did explain that to Phil. Lots of people will get in touch with me, and we'll have an initial conversation, and then they just suddenly vanish. And I think the time's not right. I don't push them, I don't message them back or anything like that. I think if I'm meant to speak to them, then they'll come back, and invariably that does happen, and I'm lucky in that respect. So it can be different. Some witnesses tell you everything all at once, and others, it's like pulling teeth. And then there are all of the, myriad of different ones in between that. I like speaking with Phil. It's really easy for me to understand what he's saying because I know the kind of background he comes from. And when he's talking about being out there in the fields, I get it. I've done it myself when I was younger. It's just that kind of life that you live when you live on the edge of town and the edge of the countryside. You kind of get the best of both worlds, and it's more rural where Phil is than where I am. So more so. I think Phil disturbed a hunting party that night. I think the brick was thrown in an intelligent diversion tactical move in an attempt to scare him and move him on. That trick would work on your average dog walker or jogger. You would think it was a dangerous thug. Make a noise by yelling and screaming for help and get yourself out of there. Phil didn't do that. He thought with his animal brain and decided enough was enough and he was going to fight. I think the creature that moved first did this, hoping Phil would follow it, and the one in the tree followed suit eventually. But I don't think they started that night. I think they started many generations ago. And the events from childhood lead me to believe there's a connection to the land here and the creatures that are being seen by Phil. There is an ancient well in the area, which is really a holy spring. Phil drank from that spring every time he passed it most days. The legend being it cured a man of the plague, so it was named for him. The major ley line, known as the Spine of Albion, runs north from Southampton on the south coast, and it passes right through the area of Biddulph. It also passes right through Biddulph, where I saw my hairy man ape, and right through many other reports, and I don't think that that's a coincidence at all. There are also several communication beacons that run across the country, and Biddulph has this also. From Winter Hill, if possible, I can see out across the plain, and if I waved at Phil, he could look back and wave at me. We know these beacons were used for defence purposes too, as you see your enemy advancing, coming from miles in all directions. And if you lose the advantage, you can retreat over the hill, giving you time to flee. They were also used for fire beacons, and when lit, they would be seen for hundreds of miles, each lighting theirs as they saw the flare on the next hill over. We know they had a connection to early man, and I believe cryptids also use these routes too. Did the hairy man, who made no noise, use his energy to appear behind the boys that day? Is that why he was so silent? Was he going about what he normally would and was disturbed by the lads? I think that's what happened to me in 82. I think, like Phil and his mates, I stumbled into something I didn't understand and still don't. The ancients spoke of the Fae, and we use the word in the wrong way in modern times. The Fae are not just Tinkerbells and Pixies sprinkling magic dust as they go. They're not little elves that fix your shoes. They're far more complicated and connected to nature than that. Some of them tend to they heal it. They go around mending what we wreck. Others have different agendas and are connected in different ways to that land. And they will scare the wits out of you given the opportunity. The Fae is like an old umbrella of a word, that means of the non-human realm. Some are boggarts and dwarf-like, others are 7 foot tall and covered in hair. Some look like ape men and others are snouted like a dog, and these days we might call that a shuck. They come in all manner of shapes and sizes and have their own take on things. We dismiss the ancient tales of them as, just folklore with no true meaning. But I'd urge you to look at it another way. The ancients passed this law down by mouth because it was important, and we should never forget that. It was our power to engage with them, our way of seeing into other realms, not shackled by men. It was taken from us to make us weak, just like the Picts of old who'd enslave entire people to use at their will. The elite have done that to us since the dawn of time. And when I say there is magic within us, I don't mean hocus pocus. I mean the energy we carry, our natural connection to the earth energy, and our natural connection to the ancient ones. It's why some folk like myself and Phil can't keep a watch working. It's why many of you get shocked or zapped constantly through life. It's why you're connected to crystals. It's why so many of us feel unheard, off kilter, and anxious. That's your power, combined with the earth energy. It's trying to heal you. But society's told you to deny it. Don't. Feel it. Bathe in it. Get used to it. Know what it feels like. And let the non-listeners see to themselves they're not your priority. Your life is on a path that can be chosen by you. Don't stay silent. Ask all the questions you want. And if you want to share your experience, then you should. And you be proud of what makes you different. Nourish it. Encourage it. It's what makes you, you. And walk to your own beat always. If everyone who had an experience that felt they were wary of sharing held hands, we'd wrap the world many times over. We are a growing community now, and you are more than welcome to join us. I wish I'd had access to all of this back when I started out, 42 years ago now. Things have come so far in the UK, and it's absolutely amazing to see. Over the past few weeks, I've shared with you some awesome accounts that are coming from people. We've heard from Daisy, who's having encounters on her family farm on the borders of Surrey and Sussex. We heard from Fred and the werewolf that he saw in the window, and his carer, Glossy Gleamer, who helped with all of those things for the last 18 years. We heard from a lovely lady who had an experience in the Forest of Dean, where she was watched by a wild man. She also had activity at home. And the list is growing longer as we speak. And in the next few weeks, you'll hear from more people that I've managed to sit down with, like Jay, who explained his experience on the Isle of Wight when he saw 3 dogmen. I have other witnesses who have sat down and recorded with me and shared their experiences from the UK. And it's an ever-growing thing now. When I first started, I couldn't get people to listen to me. And now, all these years on, I'm being interviewed by The Guardian, and television shows are knocking at my door. Because people know that there are more things out there than we are told. They feel it for themselves, they're not fools. And people know now places to go and report. They know where to go and speak to other people the same as them. They listen to the podcasts that you listen to, and they're on Twitter or they're on Facebook, actively searching information. There are so many people in the UK now who are out there in the woodlands. Not even my organisation, which is wonderful to see. There are so many people who've put their own organisations together, and they're out there week in, week out, doing what they do, trying to find evidence to prove in a physical way that these creatures exist. Because it seems to be the burden is on the witness always to provide all of the information behind the event that happened to them. And that seems to be the only time in life that you're expected to do that. If you saw a crime, nobody expects you to know who those criminals are, what their agenda was and why they did what they did. Did they mean to frighten that person, or it was an accidental? Nobody asks those questions, And it's exactly the same when you're out walking with the dog and something throws a brick at you from the side of the path. Or you're out on your horse and you see a tall, hairy, ape-like creature run behind a tree. Or you're courting in the car with your girlfriend and you see a werewolf as it presses down on the bonnet of your car. These stories come in constantly, all of the time, and many of them are happening currently as me and you speak. And it will continue to happen like this, and you'll hear more and more of them as the years go on. People want to know what it was that they saw. They want to know what happened to them. In the same way, you want to answers if you've seen a UFO, or you've suffered an abduction event, or you've seen a spirit or a ghost or something demonic. You want to know why. You want to understand why you saw it. Why wasn't it somebody else, There are many, many questions that come with our encounters. And if you're me, sometimes you have to come to terms with the fact that you're never going to know. I don't know what he was who I saw that day. And with hindsight, like Phil, if I went back, I wouldn't run. I'd ask him questions, what he was and where he was from and why did he do that? Was I just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Was he there before me and I didn't leave in time? That's what it feels like, I've got to be honest. But at other times, it feels like I've been connected to him for millennia. And that's a feeling I can't explain. And I feel like he knows me almost as well as Mark does. And that's another thing that I can't explain because I feel like I know him in the same way. Yet all we had was that small moment in time that definitely changed my life. Phil said that if it hadn't have thrown a brick at him that day, none of this would have ever happened. And when he said it, I kind of shed a silent tear because he has no idea how many times I've said that. If he hadn't leant out of those bushes that day, none of this would have happened. And a huge part of me is so angry at him that he did. And another part is incredibly grateful because if he didn't, I wouldn't be sat here talking to you today. Thank you for tuning in tonight. I appreciate it greatly. And I will be back soon with more cases from the BBR files. Good night, everyone.